The
Here
Stormbreaker,
you
a
are,
story
dear.
in 3 parts.
Thank
Part
you,
1,
ma'am.
when the
It
angels came
smells
knocking.
wonderful.
And one
She
for
stood
you.
at the frosted window with both hands wrapped
They're
around a mug
coming
of
for
chamomile
us.
tea that had gone cold an hour ago.
Stay close, boy.
Dorothy Mercer did not notice the cold tea.
Please, let us in.
She was
We're
watching
freezing
the
out
sky.
here.
Get
It
back.
had turned
This is
the
our
color
home.
of a bad
We have nowhere
bruise,
else to
deep
go.
purple at the edges, sickly green near the horizon, and the wind had begun to do something she had not heard in 30 years. It had begun to scream. Not howl, not moan, scream. A high sustained note like something enormous was being torn apart above the clouds. She was 78 years old. She had lived on this land her entire life. She knew what a serious Wyoming winter looked like, and this was not a serious Wyoming winter. This was something older than that. "You feel it too," she said. Sergeant, her golden retriever, lifted his gray muzzle from the braided rug near the wood stove. He was 11 years old, which was old for his breed, and the cold had settled into his joints, the way it settles into old joints everywhere quietly and permanently. He looked at her with eyes that were still warm, still present, and then he put his muzzle back down and exhaled a long breath through his nose. Dorothy looked at the dog for a moment. She had named him Sergeant 11 years ago when he was a puppy, a small gold bundle she had brought home from a litter at the Halverson place down the road. She had named him without thinking hard about it, the way you sometimes name things. The name had simply arrived and attached itself, and she had never examined why until later. Until enough years had passed that she could look at it honestly and understand that the name had come from somewhere she had not been paying attention to. From Jimmy, most likely. From the part of her that was always reaching toward Jimmy, even when she was not consciously aware of reaching. She put her hand on his head. "Storm coming," she said quietly. The farmhouse sat on 214 acres of high plains in Sheridan County, Wyoming. Harold had bought the land the year they married, 1968, when you could still buy land in Wyoming for something close to nothing if you were willing to work it. And Harold Mercer had been willing to work anything. He was that kind of man, the kind who got up before the sun, not because he had to, but because he believed the day belonged to the people who showed up for the beginning of it. He had built the Victorian farmhouse himself over 3 summers, working on weekends with his brother Cliff and a rotating crew of neighbors who traded labor for Dorothy's cooking. The house had gone up board by board, beam by beam, with Harold's hands on every piece of it. He had painted it yellow because Dorothy had asked him to. He said yellow was a ridiculous color for a house in Wyoming. She said a ridiculous color was exactly what this flat gray landscape needed. He painted it yellow. He had been gone 5 years now, died in his sleep in the same bed where they had slept together for 51 years, which was, Dorothy believed, the most decent way a man could go. She had woken up at 4 in the morning to find him still and cool beside her, his face perfectly relaxed, all the worry he had carried in his jaw for decades finally released. She had lain next to him for a long time before she called anyone. She did not regret those quiet hours. They were the last thing he had given her, time to say goodbye on her own terms in the dark without witnesses. Time to tell him everything she had not managed to say in 51 years of trying, and to understand in the silence that followed that he had already known all of it. He had always known. The radio on the kitchen counter crackled. The National Weather Service is issuing a blizzard warning for all of Sheridan County effective at 6 p.m. this evening. Winds will reach 60 to 70 miles per hour. Total snowfall accumulation of 30 to 40 inches is expected by morning. Residents are strongly advised to remain indoors, and Dorothy turned the radio off. She had already checked the wood pile. It was stacked high on the back porch, covered with a tarp weighted down by 4 cinder blocks. She had already brought extra logs inside and stacked them beside the cast iron stove in the living room. She had already filled every large pot she owned with water in case the pipes froze. She had checked the kerosene supply for the hurricane lamps, located the extra blankets in the cedar chest at the foot of the bed, confirmed that the storm cellar behind the garden was unobstructed and accessible. Dorothy Mercer had been a registered nurse at Sheridan County Memorial Hospital for 40 years. She had spent 4 decades in an emergency room that served ranchers, farmers, miners, and their children across the whole of the High Plains. She had seen what happened when people were caught unprepared in a Wyoming winter. She had held the hands of people who had not prepared. She had driven to their funerals afterward and stood at the graveside in her good coat and thought they should have listened to the radio. She did not intend to be one of them. She carried her cold tea to the sink, poured it out, and looked through the kitchen window at the barn. The barn was 60 yards from the back door. Harold had rebuilt it in 1989 after the original structure was damaged in a windstorm. It was a solid building, dark red with a reinforced roof and thick walls that had weathered 35 Wyoming winters without complaint. She kept two horses in the barn, Clarence, a 20-year-old quarter horse who had been Jimmy's, and a younger mare she called Birdie. She had already brought them both extra hay and broken the ice in their water troughs. She had checked the latches on both stall doors. They would be fine. The barn was built to hold. On the wall above the kitchen sink between the window and the cabinet where she kept her good dishes, there was a framed photograph. It was a photograph of a young man in uniform. He was 23 years old in the picture, crew cut, jaw-squared eyes, carrying the particular expression that young men carry when they are trying very hard to look older than they are. He was handsome in the way that boys who grew up working outdoor land are handsome, not sculpted, not arranged, but put together correctly by a life spent in sun and weather. His name was James Mercer. Everyone had called him Jimmy. He had been gone 15 years. Below the photograph, tacked to the frame's lower left corner with a small piece of tape that Dorothy replaced every few years as it yellowed, was a card. It was the size of a business card. It read in neat block letters that Dorothy had written herself the week after the funeral, "Rangers lead the way." She touched the edge of the frame with one finger. One finger the way you touch something you are afraid of disturbing. "Big one tonight, baby," she said. "But we're ready. We're always ready." She said it to the photograph the way she said many things to the photograph, not because she believed he could hear her, but because the habit of talking to him was one she had never been willing to surrender. And at 78, she had earned the right to keep the habits that helped her. Then she went to check the deadbolts on both doors. The power went out at 6:14 p.m. Dorothy was in the kitchen when it happened. The refrigerator's hum ceased. The clock on the microwave went dark, and the furnace in the basement gave two short coughs and fell silent. The house dropped into a darkness so complete that for a moment she could see nothing at all. Then her eyes began to adjust, and the faint gray light pushing through the frosted windows gave back the shapes of things. She did not curse. She did not panic. She counted to 3. Then she moved. The kerosene lamps were on the shelf in the pantry. She lit 4 of them, carrying them to the living room, the kitchen, the hallway, and the bedroom. The cast iron stove was already loaded with wood, and she got it burning with 2 matches, the orange light spreading across the walls and bringing the room back to something close to warmth. She dragged the heavy cedar chest away from the bedroom wall, opened it, and pulled out the extra blankets, the quilts her mother had made, the wool blankets from the Army surplus store in Gillette that Harold had bought in 1974, and that were still, 50 years later, the warmest things she owned. There was something Harold had understood about quality that most people had forgotten, that the right thing purchased once lasted longer than the wrong thing purchased a dozen times. She checked the shelf near the back door. The .38 special revolver was where it always was, in the cigar box behind the extra flashlight batteries. She took it out, checked the cylinder, snapped it shut, and put it in the pocket of her apron. She did not think much about this. It was simply part of preparing, the same as lighting the lamps. Then she settled into her rocking chair. Sergeant came and put his head in her lap without being asked. The fire in the stove popped and breathed. The wind outside had gone beyond screaming. It had reached a register that was less sound than pressure, a constant physical force that pressed against the walls and found every gap in the window frames and sent thin, cold fingers under the doors. Dorothy pulled the oldest quilt up to her chin. It was a double wedding ring pattern. Her mother had made it, and her mother's mother before that had started it. Some of the fabric squares went back to dresses and shirts from the 1920s, little rectangles of cotton that had once been someone's everyday clothing and were now part of something that outlasted the people who wore them. She thought about that sometimes, about how cloth persisted, about how something as fragile as cotton could survive decades in a cedar chest and come out still useful, still warm, still itself. She rocked slowly and listened to the storm. The first thing she heard was not the storm. It was a low rumble beneath the storm, something rhythmic, something mechanical, something that did not belong to wind or snow or the cracking of cold wood. It grew from beneath perception to something she could feel in her chest, a deep guttural vibration that Sergeant felt too, because his head came up from her lap and both his ears swiveled forward like antennae finding a signal. Dorothy set her quilts aside. She rose from the chair. She went to the window and used her thumbnail to scratch a circle in the frost on the glass. Headlights, not one set, not two. A column of them single file moving through the whiteout at the end of her driveway. They moved slowly, unsteadily, swaying with the drifts lurching when the ice caught the wheels. The beams cut through the driving snow like blades and did nothing useful because beyond 10 feet the snow simply absorbed all light and returned nothing. Dorothy counted 9 motorcycles. She stood at the window for a moment, watching the lights come toward her house with the slow, struggling determination of things that have gone too far to turn back. Then she walked to the gun cabinet at the far end of the hallway, opened it with the key she kept in the blue pottery jar on the top shelf, and took down Harold's shotgun. It was a 12-gauge side-by-side double barrel, old enough to have a crack in the stock that Harold had repaired with 2 wraps of electrical tape that he always meant to replace properly. The electrical tape was still there. Dorothy broke the breech, examined the shells, and snapped it shut with the practiced motion of a woman who had grown up on a ranch in Wyoming and had been shooting since she was 9 years old. She walked back to the living room. She stood in front of the fire with the shotgun in both hands and she waited. The engines cut out. The sudden silence was almost as shocking as the noise had been. In the absence of the engines, the storm rushed in to fill the space. The scream of the wind, the hiss of driven snow against the glass, the groan of the old house under the weight of what was accumulating on its roof. Then the boots, heavy boots on the porch boards. Multiple sets of them, the sound irregular, some heavier than others, all of them deliberate. The porch creaked and complained under the weight. And then the knock. It was not a polite knock. It was not the knock of a salesman or a neighbor or someone dropping off a Christmas tin. It was a fist hitting the door hard enough to shift the frame in its housing, a knock that said, "We are outside in the cold and we are not leaving." Dorothy raised the shotgun. She leveled it at the center of the door. "Get off my property." Her voice came out steady and flat. "I am armed and I will not ask twice." A pause, then a voice came through the door. It was deep, genuinely deep, not performed deep. The kind of voice that belongs to a large man who has had it long enough to stop trying to make it sound like anything other than what it is. And beneath the depth, it was shaking. Not with aggression, with cold. "Ma'am?" A pause, a breath that she could hear even through the storm and the thick oak of the door. "Ma'am, we are in serious trouble out here. One of my men is hurt. We've got nowhere to go and we cannot ride in this." "I don't know you," Dorothy said. "No, ma'am, you don't." Another breath. "I'm not asking you to trust us. I'm asking you to look at my man Gravel before you make your decision. He's been down twice, his leg is bad, and I think we've got maybe an hour before it gets a lot worse." Dorothy's jaw tightened. She had made the same calculation 1,000 times, in 1,000 different ways, the calculation between what you are afraid of and what the body in front of you needs. Fear and medicine had always been in tension for her, and medicine had always won. Not because she was fearless, but because she had learned over decades of emergency rooms and trauma bays, and the particular education of seeing what happens when help comes too late, that fear was generally wrong about the things it was most certain about. "How many?" she said. "9 of us." "Any weapons?" "Yes, ma'am. We'll put them down wherever you tell us." Dorothy thought about Jimmy. She thought about the framed photograph above the kitchen sink. She thought about what Jimmy would say if he could see her now standing in her own living room, pointing a shotgun at her own front door while a hurt man sat outside in a Wyoming blizzard. He would say, "Mom, come on, you're a nurse, open the door." "Step back from the door," Dorothy said. "All of you, I want to hear 9 sets of feet take 3 steps back." The shuffling was immediate. She counted the sounds. 9. She crossed to the door and threw the deadbolt. She grabbed the handle and pulled it open. The storm hit her like something solid, a wall of ice and wind and driving snow that stung every exposed surface of her face and stole the breath from her lungs. The cold came in out immediately, pushing past her, finding the warm air and fighting it for the room. In the doorway, in the flickering orange light cast by the hurricane lamp on the hall table, stood a group of men who looked less like men than like creatures the storm had assembled from its own materials. They were huge, all of them made larger by the layers of leather and denim and soaked wool. Their beards had frozen. Their eyebrows were white with packed snow. They wore goggles and scarves and heavy gloves, and they were coated, all 9 of them, in a layer of ice that told the story of how long they had been out in this and what it had cost them. The man at the front stepped into the light. He was enormous. Not in the exaggerated way of men who spend their lives in gyms, but in the foundational way of a man who was simply built large by genetics and then made larger by a life of physical work. He stood 6 feet 4 inches and his shoulders blocked the doorway behind him. His leather vest was dark and soaked, and on the back of it Dorothy could see a patch, though she couldn't read it clearly from this angle. His face, where it was visible above the frozen scarf he had pulled down, was rough terrain. A scar cut cleanly through his left eyebrow and continued a half-inch onto his cheekbone. His jaw was thick under a gray beard that had gone to ice. His eyes were gray-green, and at this moment they were doing something Dorothy had not expected. They were asking, not demanding, not threatening, asking. He raised both hands slowly, palms out, and held them at shoulder height. "My name is Rance Bodine," he said. "Most people call me Hatchet. We're the ironbound MC out of Casper." He tilted his head slightly to his left. "My man Gravel is behind me. I need you to see him." Dorothy kept the shotgun level and looked past Rance Bodine. 2 men stepped aside and a third man became visible between them. He was being supported under both arms, his weight distributed between the 2 men holding him and his right leg. Dorothy saw it immediately, the way she always saw injuries, the same way a good mechanic sees the damaged part before he sees anything else. His right leg was wrong. The way he held it, the way it hung, the careful, controlled way the men beside him were managing his weight. Her eyes moved to his face. It was pale with a gray tinge underneath. He was sweating despite the cold, and his jaw was set in the hard-locked way of someone who has been managing serious pain for too long and is running out of the resources required to manage it. Dorothy looked at his leg again. Then she lowered the shotgun. Not all the way. She lowered it until the barrel was pointing at the porch boards. She looked at Rance Bodine. "Get him inside," she said, "and the rest of you weapons on the floor before you come through the door. Everything. I find out one of you held something back, I will not be as patient as I'm being now." Rance Bodine looked at her for 1 second with an expression she could not entirely read. It contained surprise and relief and something else. Something older and more complicated that she didn't have time to examine. "Yes, ma'am," he said. They came in, the hallway and living room filled with the smell of wet leather and cold metal, and the particular sharp scent of men who have been outdoors in serious weather for too long. They moved carefully, all of them, with a collective awareness of the smallness of the space they were entering and what it had cost to be let into it. They dripped on the hardwood floor. They tracked snow. Their breath came in visible clouds in the cold hallway before the warmth of the stove reached them. Rance Bodine was the first one through the door. He reached into the back of his belt and brought out a heavy pistol, set it on the floor, and stepped aside. One by one, the men behind him did the same. Other handgun, 3 hunting knives, a set of brass knuckles, a short length of chain. The pile that assembled itself on Dorothy's hallway floor was an education in the kind of men these were and the kind of world they moved through. When they were done, Rance Bodine looked at Dorothy. "That's everything," he said. "Kick them to the corner," Dorothy said. He did. "Now," Dorothy said, and she set the shotgun against the wall, not hiding it, not surrendering it, simply setting it aside the way you set aside something you intend to pick up again. "Bring him to the armchair by the stove. Sit him down gently." She did not say gently twice. She said it once, and she looked at the men holding Gravel. When she said it, and her voice carried the tone of a woman who had said gently to a lot of large people over a lot of years and knew how to make it land. The men moved Gravel to the armchair. He was younger than most of them, mid-30s, with a dark beard and a sleeve of tattoos on each forearm that disappeared under the cuffs of his jacket. He lowered himself into the chair with the careful, controlled motion of someone managing a body that has become an adversary. His face went a shade paler when they set his leg down. Dorothy knelt beside the chair. She did not ask permission. She moved his hands away from his thigh and began assessing her fingers, moving with the particular efficiency of 40 years of this. She could feel the heat radiating before she even touched the fabric. She pressed 2 fingers lightly against the inner thigh and watched his face. He did not react the way she expected. She pressed lower toward the knee. There, his breath caught. The muscle along his jaw tightened to a cord. "How long since the accident?" she asked without looking up. "Maybe 3 hours, Rance said from behind her. "He went down on a patch of ice at the turn onto your road." Bike came down on top of him. Did he lose consciousness? Briefly, maybe 30 seconds. Dorothy finished her examination and rocked back on her heels. She looked at the leg for a moment, in the way she looked at things that required a decision fully without flinching, making sure she saw what was actually there rather than what was convenient. Then she looked up at the group of men standing in her living room. There were 9 of them. In the kerosene lamplight, their faces ranged from young. One of them barely looked 20, standing near the hallway door with his arms wrapped around himself and his teeth chattering audibly to weathered the faces of men who had spent decades outdoors in all conditions. All of them were watching her with the particular attention of people whose situation depends on a stranger's decision. "The leg isn't broken," she said. "Not displaced anyway. There may be a hairline fracture, but that's not the priority. The priority is that the swelling is compressing tissue, and if it gets worse, we'll be looking at a much more serious problem." She looked at Rance. "I have anti-inflammatory medication, and I have supplies for a proper compression wrap. But first, wet coats off. Shake them out on the porch, not on my floors. Anyone whose feet are wet gets boots off. Stack them by the door. I want everyone dry within 10 minutes. No one moved for a half second. Then Rance Bodine said, "You heard her. Move." They moved. Dorothy went to the kitchen. She stood at the stove and lit the burner with a long match, holding it to the bottom and listening to the catch. She pulled the heavy stew pot from the back burner venison stew she had made 2 days ago, thick with root vegetables and barley, and set it on the heat. She put the kettle on beside it. Through the kitchen window looking out into the white void of the storm, she could see nothing. 60 yards to the barn, and the barn might as well have been on another continent. She thought about Clarence and Bertie alone in their stalls. She had given them extra hay. The barn was solid. Harold had built it to hold, and everything Harold built held. She turned back to the stove and stirred the stew and took mugs from the cabinet. She counted them. 11 mugs. Enough. From the living room came the sounds of a group of large men attempting to be quiet in a space not designed for them, the careful setting down of heavy things, the muffled exchange of low voices, the creak of floorboards under redistributed weight. She could hear the youngest one saying something in a low voice, and she could hear one of the older men answer him in a tone that was short but not unkind. She was reaching for the coffee when she heard it. It was less a sound than the ghost of one so faint that if the storm had been any louder, she would have missed it entirely. A creak. Not the house settling. She knew that sound like she knew her own heartbeat, had known it for 56 years. This was the sound of weight on wood, the sound of a board that had not been touched in hours being touched by something alive. It came from the direction of the barn. Dorothy set the coffee tin down. She went back to the kitchen window and pressed her face close to the glass. She had scratched a clear spot in the frost earlier, and it had refogged, but she scraped it again with her thumbnail and looked through. The storm was total. White on white, the wind driving the snow horizontal, the world reduced to about 6 feet of visibility in any direction. And then in the beam of the one motorcycle headlight that was still on one of the bikes had not been fully switched off. Its headlight, cutting through the snow at a low angle toward the barn, she saw a shape, a silhouette, moving, not toward the house. Away from the house, toward the barn, pushing through the drifts with the desperate, leaning urgency of someone who is very cold and needs to get out of the weather and is willing to go anywhere that offers walls and a roof. Dorothy watched the silhouette reach the barn and push through the side door which she had closed, but apparently had not latched properly against the wind. She stood very still for a moment. 9 men were in her living room. Someone else was in her barn. She did not go back to the living room immediately. She stood in her kitchen and she thought about the situation with the same methodical clarity that had made her a good nurse for 4 decades. The men in her living room had accounted for themselves. They had not known about this person. She was reasonably certain of that. The alarm that would have crossed Rance Bodine's face if he'd known about a 10th person would not have been easy to fake, which meant this 10th person was not with them. Dorothy confirmed the revolver was still in her apron pocket. Then she went to the living room doorway. All 9 men looked up. "I need one of you," Dorothy said, looking at Rance Bodine. "The rest stay here. No one touches anything in this house while I'm gone." Rance Bodine stood immediately. He didn't ask questions. Dorothy noted this and filed it away. A man who had been in situations that required immediate compliance rather than discussion. Dorothy went to the back door and took her heavy wool coat from the hook beside it. She put it on, buttoned it, pulled on her boots, wrapped her scarf. She opened the back door. The storm hit her again. Full force, no shelter, just the raw, screaming cold of a Wyoming blizzard in December, 60-mile-per-hour winds driving snow that felt like ground glass against any exposed skin. She stepped out. Rance Bodine was directly behind her. She had not looked back to check whether he had a coat on. He was an adult. He was substantially larger than she was. He would manage. She put her head down and walked. The 40 yards to the barn was a different distance at night in a blizzard than it was on a summer afternoon. The snow was calf-deep in the open areas and knee-deep in the drifts, and the wind was constant and directional, pressing against her right side with a force that required her to lean into it. She counted her steps the way she always counted them on this path: 7 to the garden fence, 18 to the corner of the chicken coop, then straight ahead to the barn, and she made each step deliberately, planting her foot before shifting her weight. Behind her, close enough that she could feel his presence in the dark, Rance Bodine kept pace. She reached the barn door. It was cracked open 3 inches, the wind pushing and pulling it in irregular lurches. She put her hand on the handle and looked back at Rance. She held one finger to her lips. He nodded. Dorothy pushed the door open and stepped inside. The barn smell wrapped around her immediately, hay and horse, and the smell of old wood smells so deeply associated with her entire life that they were not so much a smell as a physical memory. Clarence shifted in his stall and blew through his nose. Bertie moved to the back of hers. The barn was dark except for the faint gray that came through the cracks in the boards. Dorothy stood still and let her eyes adjust. She could hear breathing. It was not the horses. "Come out," Dorothy said. Her voice was even. "I know you're in here. I'm armed, but I'm not going to use it unless you give me a reason." Silence. Then a sound from the hayloft. A shuffle, the whisper of hay being disturbed, the particular sound of someone who was trying to be still and couldn't manage it because their body was shaking too hard. Rance Bodine moved. He crossed the barn floor in 4 long strides and got to the loft ladder before Dorothy could say anything. He went up 2 rungs. He reached up and closed his hand around a boot, a small boot comically too large for the foot inside it, and pulled. There was a yelp, a short, sharp, genuinely frightened sound, and then a figure tumbled down from the edge of the loft and landed in the loose hay below, with an impact that raised a small cloud of dust. Dorothy was beside the figure before Rance had come back down the ladder. She knelt. It was a girl. She was young, 16 maybe, or younger, and she was wearing layers of mismatched clothing that were soaked through despite the fact that she'd gotten out of the weather. She had a winter coat 2 sizes too large, a sweatshirt beneath it, jeans with the knees worn through, and the oversized boots that had given her away. Her hair was brown and matted against her face with melted snow and sweat. Her lips had a blue tinge that Dorothy clocked immediately and clinically. The girl scrambled backward in the hay until she hit the stall door, and then she held up a rusted screwdriver in front of her with both hands, her arms shaking so hard the tool rattled. "Get back," the girl said. Her voice was cracked and thin with cold, and something else that Dorothy recognized, the particular register of someone who has been frightened for a very long time and is now at the absolute end of their resources trying to sound like someone who hasn't been. Dorothy held up both hands and let the girl see them. "I'm not going to hurt you," Dorothy said. She kept her voice low and flat, and even the voice she had used in emergency rooms for 40 years when a frightened patient needed something to anchor to. "My name is Dorothy Mercer. This is my farm. I'm a nurse. Can you tell me your name?" The girl's eyes moved to Rance Bodine, who was standing at the base of the ladder behind Dorothy. Something moved across the girl's face, not the general fear, but a specific recognition. She looked at his vest, at the patch. She seemed to be making a calculation. She looked back at Dorothy. "Renma," the girl said. Her voice broke slightly on the single syllable. "Okay, Renma," Dorothy said. She reached out very slowly and pushed the screwdriver gently aside. The girl let her. "How long have you been outside?" "I don't, a long time. My car went in the ditch, miles back." The girl was speaking in pieces, her breath coming in short pulls. "I saw the headlights. I followed them because I thought maybe I could find somewhere." "You walked," Dorothy said. "I didn't want to freeze." Dorothy glanced at Wren's feet. The boots were enormous, and the girl's own feet inside them were, she could tell from the way the girl was sitting, The way she was not moving her feet at all, the careful stillness of someone who has learned that moving them hurts at the early stages of frostnip at a minimum. Dorothy looked back at Rance Bodine. He was not the man who had knocked on her door 20 minutes ago. Something had shifted in his face when the girl fell out of the hayloft. Some quality of the hard surface had gone soft in a way that he had not managed to control quickly enough. He was looking at Wren with an expression that Dorothy filed away without examining because there were more urgent things. "Pick her up," Dorothy said. "She can't walk on those feet." Rance Bodine knelt down without hesitation. He said quietly, "It's okay. I've got you." He slipped one arm under Wren's knees and lifted her as though she weighed nothing, which she nearly didn't, Dorothy thought, and stood up. The girl was too cold and too exhausted to fight him. She put her head against his chest and closed her eyes. Dorothy led them back through the storm. When they came in through the back door, Dorothy ahead and Rance behind, with the girl in his arms, the living room went quiet in a way that was different from the quiet before. The 9 bikers who had been in the process of warming themselves, removing boots, accepting the mugs of stew Dorothy had left warming all of them, stopped. All of them looked at the girl. The youngest one, the boy with the chattering teeth, stood up from the floor so fast he knocked over his mug. Dorothy set her coat on the hook. "Make room by the stove," she said. "She goes in the center. Everybody else moves out." They moved. Rance set Wren on the floor near the fire, and Dorothy knelt beside her and began assessing her feet with the same methodical directness she had used on Gravel's leg. The girl hissed through her teeth when Dorothy touched her left foot. "Frostnip," Dorothy said. "Both feet. We got her in time, but just." She looked up at the men. "Warm water, not hot. Lukewarm. Someone fill the basin on the kitchen counter. If you can hold your hand in it comfortably, it's right. Do not use hot water." One of the men, a heavy-set one with a spiderweb tattoo on his neck, who they apparently called Slab, went to the kitchen immediately. Dorothy looked at the girl. "Wren," she said, "you're going to be all right. I've got you." The girl looked up at her. Her eyes were brown and very tired, and beneath the exhaustion there was something in them that Dorothy recognized from 40 years of emergency rooms and the particular patients who arrived in them, not because of accidents, but because of choices that other people had made for them. A fear that had been there before the storm started and would still be there when the storm was over. A fear that was not about weather. Dorothy had seen that fear before. She knew exactly what it meant. She did not ask about it tonight. There would be time if she handled the next few hours correctly. "Rest," Dorothy said. "Nobody here is going to hurt you." The fire in the cast iron stove popped and breathed. The storm pressed against the walls. The lamplight moved slowly over the faces of 9 rough men who were eating Dorothy Mercer's stew and sitting carefully on her furniture, and not any of them making a sudden move. Dorothy sat back in her rocking chair and let the room settle. She looked at the mantel above the fireplace where the kerosene lamp threw its light across the objects arranged there, a small clay pot that Jimmy had made in 3rd grade, one of his first attempts at ceramics, lopsided and beautiful. A photograph of Harold and Dorothy on their 40th anniversary, Harold grinning and Dorothy looking at him sideways with the expression she'd had on her face for 51 years, whenever he made her happy, and she didn't want him to see that he had. A glass paperweight shaped like a globe that had belonged to Dorothy's mother, and the framed photograph of the young man in uniform. Rance Bodine had gone back to the armchair closest to the door. He was not eating, he was looking at the mantel. Dorothy watched him from across the room. She watched his body do something she had seen bodies do when they recognized something they were not prepared to recognize. It was a subtle thing, a stillness that was different from relaxed stillness, a stillness that was braced, the stillness of a man who has seen something and is trying to decide what to do about it. He looked at the photograph for a long time. His coffee mug had gone still in his hand. Dorothy watched him look at it. She watched the stillness deepen. She watched his jaw work almost imperceptibly. She watched his free hand close slowly on the armrest of the chair. Then he set the mug down on the side table very carefully, and he stood up. The fire breathed. The storm pressed in. The room was warm and full of living people and the smell of venison stew. And Dorothy Mercer sat in her rocking chair and watched Rance Bodine walk toward the mantel like a man walking towards something he had been walking toward for a very long time and had never expected to actually reach. She already knew before he touched the frame what was coming. She did not know how she knew. She simply did. The way you know certain things, not because you've reasoned your way to them, but because something older than reason has recognized them first. She sat very still, and she waited. Part 2. What the storm buried. The room shifted before Rance touched the frame. It was not a sound or a movement that did it. It was something more subtle than that, a change in the quality of attention, the way a room full of people registers when one person in it has become extraordinary. The men nearest to Rance felt it first. Slab looked up from his stew. Dex, the youngest, stopped mid-sentence. One by one, without knowing exactly why, the room turned toward Rance Bodine and what he was walking toward. He reached out and took the frame in both hands. His hands were enormous and rough and covered in the particular scars of a life lived without much caution, and he held the frame the way you hold something you are afraid might disappear if you move too quickly. Not lifting it, not tilting it toward the light, just holding it. James Mercer, Rance said. His voice was barely above a murmur. But in that room, in that silence, it was the loudest thing Dorothy had heard all night. She felt the words in her chest before she processed them with her mind. 2 words. Her son's name. Coming out of the mouth of a man she had never seen before tonight, spoken with a weight that could only belong to someone who had said that name many times in private, many times over many years in the dark. 2nd Battalion, Rance said. He stopped, swallowed. Charlie Company. A longer pause. Rangers. Dorothy's hands came apart in her lap. She looked at her hands as though they belonged to someone else, as though the act of her fingers separating was something happening at a distance. Then she looked back at Rance Bodine, at the width of his shoulders under the damp leather vest, at the way his head had dropped slightly forward. Her coffee mug was in her right hand. She felt it leave her fingers before she made any decision to release it. It hit the hardwood floor and broke cleanly in two, the dark coffee spreading in a fan shape across the boards, and the sound of it breaking was the only sound in the room for what felt like a very long time. Rance turned around. His face had changed. She had spent the last hour reading his face, and she had learned its terrain, the deliberate neutrality, the iron quality of a man who had trained himself not to show what he was thinking. That was gone now. What was underneath it had not seen the surface in a long time. It was exposed and raw, and it looked like it hurt the way things hurt when they have been kept compressed too long and are suddenly allowed to expand. He reached up with his right hand and pulled the collar of his shirt to the side, sliding the fabric off his right shoulder. Dorothy stood up. She crossed the room. She stopped 18 inches from him and looked at his shoulder. The tattoo was done in precise military block letters, the kind of lettering that carries its own gravity, the kind that means something was meant to be permanent and done by someone who understood that permanence. The ink was clean, well-maintained, the lines still sharp after 15 years, done by someone who knew what they were doing and did it with care. J. Mercer. And below it, on a single line, October 14th, 2009, Dorothy stood very still. She was a nurse. She had spent 40 years being the person in the room who did not fall apart. She had been present when grief arrived, like a physical force, and her job in those rooms had been to remain standing, to be the anchor point that other people oriented to when everything else was moving. She understood, standing in front of Rance Bodine in her own living room, that she was not in a hospital room. There was no patient who needed her to remain standing. But she remained standing anyway, because that was simply who she was. It was not a decision. It was structure. Tell me, she said. Her voice was steady. She did not know how it was steady, but it was. Tell me what happened. Rance looked at her. His jaw worked. He was a man who had spent a long time building a structure around certain things, a structure made of forward motion and noise, and the particular busyness of a life lived at high volume, and right now that structure was failing in ways he could not control. Sit down, Dorothy said gently. Both of us. She led him back to the armchair. She pulled the wooden chair from beside the side table and sat across from him, close enough that their knees were nearly touching. Behind her, the room was absolutely still. The men who had gone, perfectly still, Wren on the floor by the fire with her feet in the warm basin, Sergeant in the corner watching with his old patient eyes. But the room had receded. There was only this. Rance Bodine leaned forward with his elbows on his knees and his hands clasped together, and he looked at the floor for a long moment before he looked up at her. We were in the Korengal, he said. October 2009, 3rd week of the deployment. He stopped, started again. We took fire from 3 positions simultaneously, a coordinated ambush. We had 8 men in a patrol that should have had 12, but we'd had 2 vehicles go down that morning, and command hadn't redistributed yet. He shook his head at that, the old anger of it still present after 15 years. I took a round in the thigh. Femoral wasn't hit, but I was losing blood, and I couldn't move my leg. I was in the open, maybe 25 yards from cover. He stopped. In the fireplace, a log shifted and resettled. The storm pressed against the walls. The extraction bird that was inbound, Rance said. 8 minutes out. Captain was screaming at everyone to pull back to the rally point and wait. Reasonable call. Tactically correct. I would have made the same call. He looked at his hands. Your son was behind cover. He was safe. He didn't have to do anything. Dorothy said nothing. She watched his face. He came out, Rance said. He just stood up and came out, running, in open ground under active fire at a full sprint. The captain was screaming at him. I was screaming at him. I told him to go back. I told him I'd be fine. Rance's voice dropped to something barely above a whisper. I was lying. I would not have been fine. The fire breathed. He grabbed my vest. He was not a big man, your son. He was maybe my height, but he didn't have my weight. But he dragged me. 40 yards across open ground. I have thought about it for 15 years, and I still cannot explain how he did it. Rance's hands tightened against each other until the knuckles went white. He got me behind a collapsed wall, got me to the medic. The medic got a tourniquet on me inside 30 seconds, and that tourniquet is the reason I have a right leg today. The fire breathed. Jimmy took the round just as he cleared the wall, Rance said. Sniper, single shot. He stopped. A long stop. He fell against me. It was fast. I want you to know that. It was very fast. He didn't suffer. Dorothy's eyes were wet. She did not blink them clear. She simply let what was happening happen, sitting straight in her chair with her hands in her lap, and she looked at Rance Bodine's face, and she listened with everything she had. He said something, Rance said. At the end, he turned his head and he looked at me and he said it clearly. He wasn't confused. It wasn't the words of a man who didn't know what he was saying. Rance looked up and met her eyes directly and held them. He said, tell Mom don't sell the farm. She loves that view. The sound that came out of Dorothy Mercer was not a word. It was something older than words. Something that had been compressed for 15 years in the space behind her sternum, and it came out now as a single exhalation. A sound that was grief and recognition, and the profound, disorienting relief of receiving something you had stopped believing would ever come. A message. A real message. Not the clean official language of the military report she had read until she had memorized it. Not heroic action under fire. Not died of wounds sustained in combat. Her son's actual last words carried for 15 years in the chest of a man who had been looking for her. She pressed both hands flat against her sternum. Rance bowed his head. I looked for you, he said. When I got back stateside, I knew his last name. I knew he was from Wyoming. Farm boy, he always said. Yellow house. Best view in the state. Rance shook his head. Do you know how many Mercers there are in Wyoming? I hired a private investigator 3 years in. Couldn't narrow it down. I didn't know your first name. I didn't know what county. I just knew Yellow House in Wyoming and that the view was something his mother loved. He looked up at her. I never stopped looking. I want you to know that. I never decided it didn't matter. I just couldn't find you. Dorothy reached out and took his hands. His hands were enormous and rough and covered in the kind of scars that accumulate over a life lived without caution, and she took them in her 2 small hands and she held them the way she had held the hands of 1,000 patients who needed to feel another person's presence before they could find their way back to themselves. You're here now, Dorothy said. The storm brought you here. Rance looked at her hands holding his. His jaw was working and he was holding his breath in the way men hold their breath when they are trying to keep something in. I failed him, Mum, Rance said. No, Dorothy said. The word was quiet and absolute the way only truly certain things are quiet and absolute. You did not fail him. He made a choice. He made it because of who he was, not because of anything you did or didn't do. She tightened her hands slightly around his. He was always going to make that choice. I raised him to make that choice. That choice was the shape of him. She paused. Now, she said, I want you to tell me about him. Not that day. I've carried that day for 15 years, and I know every word of the official report by heart. I want you to tell me about the other days. I want you to tell me who my son was when he was a limp and not a symbol. Something broke open in Rance Bodine's face. Not broke apart, broke open. The difference matters enormously. It was not collapse, it was aperture. The opening of something that had been closed for a long time. From behind Dorothy, a voice low. The big man they called Slab said quietly, I can start, if that's okay. Dorothy looked back. Slab was sitting on the floor near the wood stove, his enormous frame folded into something smaller than it had been all night, his forearms on his knees. His eyes were red. He looked like a man who had been holding something and was grateful to be allowed to put it down. Please, Dorothy said. The dog, Slab said. Tell her about the dog first. Rance looked at Slab. Something passed between them, the particular shorthand of men who have shared significant time and significant loss, and Rance made a sound that was almost a laugh. The first sound of that kind Dorothy had heard from him. The dog, Rance said. He looked at Dorothy. Your son smuggled a ball into Fort Benning. Dorothy blinked. He what? Stray, brown and white, maybe 20 pounds. Found it outside the wire during a training exercise, and somehow, to this day, I genuinely do not know the logistics of how he managed this, somehow got it back onto the base, and hid it in the barracks for 3 weeks. Rance shook his head slowly. 19 men in that barracks. Every single one of them knew about the dog. Not one of them said a word to anyone outside. What was the dog's name? Dorothy asked. Rance smiled. A real smile, the kind that lives in the eyes first and reaches the mouth second. Sergeant, he said. Dorothy's hand went to her mouth. Behind her, Sergeant, the golden retriever, lifted his old gray head from the rug and looked around the room with the alert expression of a boy who has heard something significant. Dorothy looked at the boy. She looked at him for a long moment. She had named him Sergeant 11 years ago, without thinking hard about why. The name had simply arrived. And now, sitting in her own living room in the middle of the worst storm in 30 years, she understood for the first time where it had come from. Not from nowhere. From Jimmy. From whatever part of her had been carrying Jimmy all along and expressing him in ways she hadn't recognized. She had given her dog the same name Jimmy gave every dog he ever found. She had been doing it without knowing she was doing it. The tears came then. Not the controlled, wet eyes of earlier. These were real tears, the kind that don't ask permission, running down her face in the flickering orange light of the kerosene lamps. She let them come. She did not wipe them away. He named every stray dog Sergeant, Slab said from his place on the floor. His own voice was thick. Any animal he found. He said all dogs had already earned the rank just by being dogs. Said it was the least we could do to acknowledge it. Dorothy laughed. It was a wet and broken laugh, but it was absolutely a laugh coming up through the grief and the 15 years and the exhaustion of the night. She laughed the way you laugh when something is so perfectly, recognizably true that laughter is the only honest response. Rance Bodine watched her laugh, and the expression on his face was the expression of a man who has been carrying a very heavy thing for a very long time and has just been told he is allowed to put it down. The room exhaled, and then the house tried to kill them all. The first sound was a crack so sharp and so loud that 3 of the bikers were on their feet before the echo died. Not the sound of wood under pressure, the sound of wood that has resolved the argument with physics by losing it completely. Dorothy was on her feet the same instant. She looked at the ceiling. The plaster above the hallway had developed a sag that had not been there 20 minutes ago. A long, gradual belly of wet plaster being pushed down by the weight of snow on the roof above. As she watched, a crack ran from one side to the other, and a section of plaster the size of a dining table separated from the ceiling and came down in a white explosion of dust and debris. The roof, Rance said? He was already in motion, not the motion of panic, but the motion of a man whose instincts had been trained for situations that moved fast and required immediate correct action. Load distribution is failing. We need to move now. Another crack, deeper this time, somewhere above the master bedroom. The house shuddered, a full-body shudder that Dorothy felt through the soles of her feet. The storm cellar, Dorothy said. Her voice was entirely level. Outside, behind the garden, 40 yards past the back door. Interior access, Rance said. Blocked. Storage boxes I haven't moved in 3 years. Rance looked at her for 1/2 second. Outside it is. He turned to the room. On your feet. Everything you came in with. Gravel, you need 2 people, slab decks, you've got 'em. Ren, he looked at the girl who was already pulling her 2 large boots back onto her feet with the focused speed of someone who had spent the last hour recovering and was now spending every bit of that recovery. Can you walk? Yes, Ren said. Stay next to Mrs. Mercer. Do not leave her side. A third crack from above, and this time the main support beam running the length of the hallway bowed visibly downward. Dust rained from every joint in the ceiling. Dorothy went to the mantel. She looked at the photograph of Jimmy. She did not take it. The glass was already cracked from the vibration, and plaster dust was settling across the surface. And she understood with the absolute clarity that comes when there is no time for anything but clarity, that the photograph was going to burn with the house, and there was nothing to be done about that. The house was Harold's. The photograph was Jimmy's. What she carried of them was not on a mantle. It was not in a frame. It could not be destroyed by fire or storm. She turned away. She went to the corner of the room and picked up Sergeant. The dog was too heavy for her under normal circumstances, but she got him up and held him against her chest, and he went still and let her carry him the way old dogs do when they understand that their person needs them to be manageable. I've got the dog, a voice said beside her. It was Dex, the youngest, the kid who had been chattering with Cold 2 hours ago. He reached out and took Sergeant from her arms with careful hands, shifting the dog's weight against his own chest. I've got to eat, ma'am. Go. Dorothy looked at him, 20 years old maybe, with the face of someone who was not yet done becoming who he was going to be. Thank you, she said. They went out the back door in a group. The storm had not changed its mind. It was still the same storm it had been all night, the same 60-mile-per-hour winds, the same horizontal snow, the same cold. That was not a temperature so much as a presence, something alive and vast and entirely indifferent to human plans. It hit them as a group and tried to separate them, and for a moment it nearly succeeded. The wind caught the door and wrenched it out of Rance's hand and slammed it back against the house frame hard enough to break the glass in the small window beside it. Chain up, Rance said. Physical contact. Nobody releases until we're underground. They formed a line. Dorothy was behind Rance, her hand gripping the back of his belt. Ren was behind Dorothy, one hand locked on Dorothy's coat sleeve. Behind Ren, the men extended back toward the house, each hand on the person in front of them. Dex at the back with Sergeant tucked against his coat. Dorothy put her head down and counted. 7 steps to the garden fence. The fence was buried. She found it by feel her boot catching the top rail under the snow, and she stepped over it and kept moving. 18 steps to the corner of the chicken coop. She found the corner and turned slightly left. Straight ahead. 40 yards. She had walked this path 10,000 times in every season and condition Wyoming had offered her over 56 years. She walked it now with her eyes nearly closed against the driving snow, and she counted steps and she did not stop. Behind her, above the screaming of the wind, she heard the house. She heard it the way you hear a sound you have been dreading. Not with surprise, but with the grim recognition of something arriving that you knew was coming. A low, sustained, structural groan. Then a crack that was louder than anything she had heard all night, a sound she felt in her molars and her sternum simultaneously. Then the cascade of smaller failures that follow the main one, each piece of the structure releasing in sequence as the load it had been bearing transferred to whatever was next and overwhelmed it. She did not look back. Rance's hand closed over hers on his belt, not replacing her grip, covering it. She felt the weight of his hand, and she kept walking. The storm cellar mound appeared from the whiteout when she was 6 feet from it, a hump of snow with 2 iron handles protruding from the slanted double doors, the metal catching what little light existed. There, she said. The men fell on the doors. The snow had packed into the seams and frozen. The handles were ice-coated. They clawed at the edges with their hands, the cold biting through their gloves. Latch is center seam, Dorothy said. 6 inches below the handles. The ice will be thickest right there. Slab drove his fist into the center seam twice. The ice shattered. He found the iron ring beneath and closed his hand around it and pulled with the full weight of a man who was not small, throwing every pound of it backward. The doors gave with a shriek of frozen hinges, all releasing at once, and a black opening appeared in the snow. Cold air came up from below. But it was still air. Sheltered air. "Ren first," Dorothy said. "Then me. Then Gravel. Then everyone else. Last, man pulls the door shut and throws the interior bolt left side of the frame." They went down. The storm cellar was exactly the same as it had always been. 12 feet by 10 concrete floor and walls, wooden shelving along three sides loaded with the preserved product of 40 years of Dorothy's canning. Peaches in their syrup, green beans packed in salt, beets pickled with cloves and vinegar, apple butter, relish, corn. The fruits and vegetables of every autumn she had lived here, rendered permanent in glass row on row, the material record of a life carefully tended. The hurricane lamps were on the shelf to the left of the stairs. Dorothy found them before anyone asked. She found the tin of matches beside them. She lit both lamps and handed one to Rance and set the other on the shelf where it could throw light across the whole space. The doors above them closed. The bolt was thrown. The storm became a murmur. Not gone, still immense, still moving above them with all its force, but separated from them now by 8 feet of earth and 2 heavy wooden doors. Reduced to something like the sound of the sea heard from inland. Present, but distant. Something they had survived rather than something they were inside. Dorothy looked at her people. 10 of them and a dog. Gravel on the floor with his back against the far wall, his leg extended, his color concerning. Wren beside him, knees pulled up, the color returning to her face. Slab on an overturned crate filling most of one corner. Dex in the corner near the stairs, Sergeant pressed against his leg. Dorothy did a count. 2 lamps, enough kerosene for several hours. The canned goods required a can opener she did not have down here, but there was one on the 3rd shelf beside the emergency candles. She had put it there herself in 1987 after a tornado scare and had never removed it. She also knew exactly where Harold's moonshine was. Harold had kept a ceramic jug on the bottom shelf of the cellar's back wall since approximately 1991. He had kept it there specifically because Dorothy had told him she didn't want to see how much of it he made. She had found it on the bottom shelf during a cellar reorganization in 2003 and had left it there without comment because Harold's moonshine had exactly 3 legitimate uses, and she had wanted to keep those options available. She had not told Harold she knew. He had not asked. Some arrangements in long marriages work better unspoken. One of the 3 legitimate uses was surgical sterilization. She looked at Gravel's leg. "Body heat is our primary resource," Dorothy said. "We pack against the back wall. The concrete will stay above freezing as long as we're in here." She looked at Gravel. "How is the leg?" "Hurts," Gravel said. "Scale of 1 to 10. 7. Was an 8 an hour ago?" "Swelling, too. About the same." Dorothy crossed to him and knelt, running her hands down the leg with clinical focus. She pressed 2 fingers below the knee and watched his face. He kept it flat, but she saw his eyes. "Tell me truly," she said quietly. 9, Gravel said. Dorothy sat back on her heels. She looked at the leg in the lamplight. The swelling was visible, even through the jeans, the fabric drummed tight from just above the knee to mid-calf, the skin at the ankle taking on the dark mottled tone that she knew from experience meant tissue under pressure. It was not designed to survive indefinitely. Compartment syndrome. She had seen it 3 times in 40 years of emergency nursing. Once in a rancher whose arm had been trapped under a fence post. Once in a teenager after a rodeo injury. Once in an elderly man with an undiagnosed fracture. She knew exactly what it was, what it meant, and what it required. It required a fasciotomy, a surgical incision through the fascia to release the pressure on the pulsion and tissue beneath. It required a hospital. She looked around the storm cellar. They had 2 kerosene lamps, 40 years of canned goods, 12 by 10 feet of concrete, and Harold's moonshine. She stood up. "I need the lamp," she said, "and I need that brown ceramic jug from the bottom shelf of the back wall." Rance was beside her before she finished the sentence. He did not ask why. He had been watching her face and he knew what she had found. "Tell me what you need me to do," he said. "Hold him still," Dorothy said. "That is the most critical thing. What I'm going to do will hurt more than anything he has felt tonight. He is a large man. If he moves at the wrong moment, we will have a worse problem than the one we have now." Rance looked at Gravel. Gravel had heard all of this. He was looking at Dorothy with an expression she recognized, the expression of someone who has decided to trust a stranger with something irreplaceable. It was a profound expression, and she did not take it lightly. "You've done this before," Gravel said. "On cattle and horses," Dorothy said. 40 years of emergency medicine in a county where the nearest trauma center was 2 hours away. Human anatomy is not different in the ways that matter." A pause. "Okay," Gravel said. Dorothy took the hunting knife from the sheath on Rance's belt without asking. She upended the ceramic jug and poured Harold's moonshine over the blade until the excess dripped on the concrete floor. The smell of it filled the small space, sharp and agricultural, and 150 proved the smell of 30 years of Harold doing something in the barn he thought she didn't know about. She poured a measure over Gravel's leg. He hissed. "That's the cold," Dorothy said. "The next part will be worse. Do you want something to bite on?" Gravel looked at Rance. Rance took off his belt without comment. He folded it double and held it out. Gravel took it and put it between his teeth. "Slab," Dorothy said without turning around. Hands on his shoulders. "Dex, you take the left leg, hold it flat. Whoever is on his right side, stabilize that knee. Nobody releases until I say so." The men positioned themselves. The cellar had become an operating theater. The hurricane lamp was held at the angle Dorothy specified. Dorothy made the incision. The blade went through the denim first, then skin, then into the fascia below. She had been precise about the location based on the palpation she had done, and she was precise now, a clean, controlled cut following the line she would have followed in a hospital with proper lighting and a surgical team. Her hands were steady. They had always been steady. 40 years of making them steady. Gravel screamed into the belt. The sound was muffled but not suppressed, a raw animal sound that came from somewhere deeper than decision or control. His body went rigid, and the four men holding him used everything they had to keep him still. Dorothy completed the cut. The pressure released. It was visible, a visible relaxation of the tissue, the muscle pushing through the incision with the urgency of something that has been constrained far too long. The color of the tissue changed immediately, shifting from the dark, congested tone of compromised circulation toward pink. Dorothy exhaled a breath she had not known she was holding. She pressed the back of her hand against Gravel's ankle. "Wiggle your toes," she said. A pause. Then slowly through the pain, his toes moved. "Good," Dorothy said. She straightened. Her back ached. Her knees ached. She was 78 years old, and she had just performed emergency surgery with a hunting knife and bootleg moonshine in a concrete cellar at 3 in the morning, and she was in this moment completely all right. She looked at Rance. "Pour more moonshine over the wounds," she said. "Then give me the cleanest cloth anyone has. We leave it open. The tissue needs to breathe. Wrap it loosely." Rance did everything she said in the order she said it. Gravel passed out from the pain. His body went limp in the men's grip. "He's out," Slab said. "Is he going to make it?" "The color is coming back to his toes," Dorothy observed, wiping her hands on a rag. "He kept the leg. He's tough. He'll make it." She sat back against the wall and let herself be still for a moment. Sergeant pressed his head against her knee, and she put her hand on his head. Rance crouched in front of her. He looked at her with an expression she could not quite categorize, something between awe and grief, something that had Jimmy's name in it, even though he wasn't saying it. "I couldn't save Jimmy," Dorothy said. She said it quietly, just for Rance, just between them. "I couldn't do anything for him. He was thousands of miles away, and there was nothing I could do. Not one thing." She looked at her hands, the hands she had used all night, the hands she had used for 40 years. "I can do something for this one." Rance said nothing. He did not offer comfort, and he did not offer argument. And both of those things were the right response, and she respected him for both. After a moment, Dorothy looked up. "Tell me more," she said. "The poker game." Slab mentioned a poker game. Rance sat down on the floor beside her, his back against the concrete wall, and he looked straight ahead and started to talk. He talked about the poker game where Jimmy had bluffed the entire platoon with a pair of twos and won a month's worth of cigarettes, then given all of them away to the four men in the unit who actually smoked because he didn't smoke himself, and said it seemed wrong to hold currency you had no use for. The men he gave them to had been confused. Jimmy had told them it wasn't generosity, it was accounting. He talked about how Jimmy had carried 2 photographs, one of the farm, one of Dorothy, and How when new men arrived in the unit, Jimmy would show them the photograph of the farm and tell them that when they got home, they should drive to Wyoming because the view from that porch was the best thing in North America. And the pie inside was better than anything their own mothers made, which was, Rance said, the single most audacious claim he had ever heard a soldier make about his mother's cooking. Slab talked about how Jimmy had spent 3 weeks teaching a 19-year-old private from Louisiana how to write a letter to a girl back home because the private had grown up with almost no formal schooling and was too proud to admit he couldn't write well enough to say what he needed to say. Jimmy had ghost-written 15 letters, and every one of them apparently worked because the private and that girl were married now, Slab said, had 4 kids and a house. And the private did not know to this day that Jimmy Mercer had written every word of his courtship. Dex, the youngest, who had not known Jimmy at all, and who had been listening the whole time from his spot near the stairs, said quietly, "He sounds like someone worth knowing." "Best man I ever served with," Rance said. No hesitation at all. Dorothy sat against the cold concrete wall with her son's dog on her feet and her son's friend beside her, and the voices of men who had known her son filling the small, sheltered space, and she felt something she had not felt in 15 years. She felt him close, not gone, not absent. Present, in the room, in the voices, in the particular texture of the stories these rough men were telling, with care, the real stories, the daily stories, the stories that official reports do not contain and that families never get to hear. The stories that constitute a life actually lived. Wren had fallen asleep against Dorothy's other side, the girl's head on Dorothy's shoulder, her breathing slow and even. Dorothy did not move. She let the girl sleep. She looked at the jar of peaches on the shelf across from her. Harold had grown those peaches. She had canned them. They had been down here in the dark for 3 years, and she had never come down to get them because she had not been hungry for peaches since Harold died. Some things you stop wanting and you don't notice until suddenly the wanting comes back. She thought she might open them in the morning. Above them, the storm pressed on, but in the cellar for the first time all night, Dorothy Mercer was warm. She did not sleep. She sat through the long, dark hours with her son's dog on her feet and a sleeping girl on her shoulder, and the sound of men's breathing around her, and she thought about Jimmy and Harold and the yellow house and the 56 years she had spent on this piece of ground, and at some point she accepted quietly without drama, in the way she had always accepted difficult things, that the house was gone. The sounds from above had told her. The structural groan that continued intermittently through the early hours. The second large collapse sometime around 1 in the morning that she felt through the concrete floor. The smell that began to filter down around the too faint unmistakable, the smell of wet ash and cold smoke. The house was gone. She sat with that and let it be true. Harold built that house. Jimmy grew up in that house. Every version of her adult life had happened inside those walls. 47 Christmases. The night they brought Jimmy home from the hospital. The morning they got the phone call about Jimmy, Harold dying in the bedroom he had built with his own hands. All of it gone now. She sat with that, and she did not collapse because the things the house had held were not in the house. They were in her and in the men sleeping around her and in the old dog on her feet. They were in the stories she had just received, the stories she had not had before tonight, the real stories of who her son had been when she wasn't watching. She reached over to the shelf in the dark and felt for the can opener she kept beside the emergency candles. She found a jar of peaches. She opened it quietly, the lid giving way with the soft percussion of a good seal releasing, and the smell came up sweet and summery, the smell of August Harold's orchard along the south fence line. She ate peaches in the dark and listened to her people breathe and waited for the light. When the light came thin and gray at the bottom edge of the cellar doors, Dorothy set down the empty jar. "Up," she said, firmly. The room came awake in stages. First, Rance's eyes opened immediately, no transition. Then Dex. Then the others, the adjustment of large bodies in a small space. Gravel woke with a sharp breath and reached for his leg, and Rance was beside him before his hand got there. "Easy," Rance said. "You're okay." Gravel looked at his leg. He looked at Dorothy. He remembered. "Morning," Dorothy said. "You really did that," Gravel said. "I really did." He moved his toes. He breathed. "Thank you," he said. Just that. It was enough. Dorothy nodded once. "You'll need a surgeon today. The wound has to be properly closed and you need antibiotics. That is not optional." She looked at Rance. "He goes to a hospital before anything else happens." "Yes, ma'am," Rance said. Dorothy climbed the stairs and threw the bolt. Part 3, The Stormbreaker, rises. The doors came open and Wyoming came in. The sky above was the particular blue that only exists after a significant storm has scoured the world clean. Not the ordinary blue of an ordinary morning, but something deeper and more absolute, a blue that looked like it had been applied by someone who intended it to be permanent. The sun was low and eastern and brutal, throwing long shadows across the snow that made the landscape look sculptural, every drift and hollow defined in high contrast against every other. Dorothy climbed out of the cellar and stood on the mound of snow above it. She looked at her farm. The yellow Victorian house was gone. Not damaged, not partially standing. Gone in the way that fire combined with structural collapse makes things gone. What remained was a blackened skeleton of major timbers jutting from the snow at irregular angles, and the pile of bricks where Harold's chimney had stood, and the shell of the north exterior walls which had been furthest from the fire and had not burned completely, but had collapsed inward. Snow had fallen on the ruin throughout the night and was still falling in intermittent light curtains, softening the edges of the destruction covering the ash, making it look almost peaceful from a distance. From a distance, it looked like an abstract sculpture. From where Dorothy was standing, it looked like 56 years. She stood very still. She had processed this in the dark during the long hours in the cellar, when the sounds from above had told her everything she needed to know. She had allowed herself to understand it fully there in the quiet so that she would not be destroyed by it now in the open with other people around her who needed her to be functional. Harold built that house. Jimmy grew up in that house. 47 Christmases. Every version of her adult life. Her mother's visits. The kitchen where she had made 10,000 meals. The bedroom where Harold had died. She took a long breath of cold December air and let it out slowly. Then she heard the crunch of boots in the snow beside her. Rance Bodine came and stood next to her. He did not say anything. He looked at the ruin of the house with her, and he put his hand on her shoulder. Not a grip, not a grasp, just a presence. The weight of a hand that understood what it was standing next to. They stood that way for a while. Behind them, the others were climbing out of the cellar. She could hear them emerging, the sounds of stiff bodies adjusting to cold air and open space. She heard Wren's sharp intake of breath when the girl saw the house. Dorothy did not turn around. Harold built that house in 1968, she said, not loudly, not performing grief, stating a fact that needed to be stated the way you state a fact to make it fully real. He complained about the yellow paint for 51 years. He never admitted he liked it. She paused. He liked it very much. I could always tell. Rance kept his hand on her shoulder. It did what it was supposed to do. Dorothy said. She looked at the chimney pile at the bricks Harold had laid one by one in the summer of 1971. It held everyone safe until we could get out. That's what a house is for. She turned away from the ruin and looked at the group of people behind her. They were ragged, all of them ice-stiffened, leather hollow-eyed, the particular worn quality of people who have come through something together that has used them fully. Gravel was upright between slab and decks, his face pale but present, his jaw set with the look of a man who has decided he is going to be all right and is in the process of making that decision true. Wren was standing with her arms wrapped around herself, looking at the destroyed house with an expression that was not only grief. Dorothy could see the recognition in it, the look of someone who understood from personal experience what it meant to lose the place where you had been sheltered. Dorothy went to her. She stood in front of Wren and looked at her directly. "Are you all right?" Dorothy said. Wren looked at her. The girl's eyes were clear, despite everything, the kind of clear that belongs to young people who have been through enough to stop pretending. "I've been okay and not okay so many times, I'm not sure which one I am right now," she said. Dorothy almost smiled. "That's an honest answer," she said. "It'll do." Then she heard the engine. It had the particular sound of a large vehicle with four-wheel drive working hard through unplowed snow, engine laboring, tires compressing and releasing. Not a motorcycle. Something heavier moving up her driveway from the county road. The group went still. Dorothy turned toward the driveway. The vehicle that came around the tree line was a Sheridan County Sheriff's Department SUV, white with the gold star on the door, moving slowly through the drifts with its light bar dark. It had been on the road since before the storm fully broke. Road snow crusted along the lower panels in the way that accumulates when you drive through weather rather than wait for it to pass. It stopped 40 yards from where they were standing. The driver's door opened. The man who stepped out was in uniform department-issue coat over the tan shirt and dark pants hat pulled low. He was large across the shoulders in the way of a man who had used his physical size as a professional tool for a long time. He moved with the deliberate confidence of someone accustomed to arriving places and having those places reorganize themselves around his presence. He had not looked at the ruins of the house. He had not looked at the 9 bikers partially obscured by the snow-covered motorcycles. He was looking at Ren. Dorothy felt the girl go rigid beside her. She felt it before she saw it, the particular quality of stillness that descends on a body when it recognizes the specific threat it has been running from. Ren's shoulders went up. Her chin dropped. 3 seconds ago, she had been standing with her arms around herself against the cold. Now she was wrapped around herself for an entirely different reason. Dorothy stepped in front of her. "Deputy Parisi," Dorothy said. The man walked toward them. His eyes remained on Ren, tracking around Dorothy as though Dorothy were a minor obstruction. When he spoke past Dorothy's left shoulder. "Ren Calloway," he said, "you are in significant trouble. Theft of a motor vehicle running from a lawful guardian, multiple violations of your court-ordered placement terms." He stopped 10 feet away. His voice had the particular quality of authority performed for an audience, not genuine authority, which tends to be quiet, but performed authority which requires volume and repetition. "Get in the vehicle." "She's not going anywhere," Dorothy said. The man looked at Dorothy. His name was Garrett Spivey. Dorothy did not know him personally, which was not surprising. Sheridan County was large, and she had not been the kind of person who had regular contact with law enforcement. But she had spent 40 years in an emergency room, and she had learned over those decades what the inside of a man's character looked like when it was under pressure. She was seeing Garrett Spivey's character now. It looked like a man who had never in his professional life encountered a situation that did not eventually yield to the combination of a badge and a raised voice. "Ma'am," Spivey said with a patience that was not patience at all, "this is a law enforcement matter. This girl is a ward of the state placed in my lawful custody. I am here to return her to that custody. I would strongly encourage you to step aside." "I'm not going to do that," Dorothy said. Spivey looked at her. He looked at the destroyed house. He looked at the assembled group of people, and now he was really seeing the bikers, the leather vests, and the road-worn faces and the general collective quality of 9 men who had not been designed to be impressed by a uniform. Something moved across his face. The recalculation of a man who has walked into a situation expecting one set of variables and found something entirely different. But he had made his decision before he got out of the vehicle. Dorothy could see that in the set of his shoulders and the line of his jaw, and men like Garrett Spivey did not unmake decisions easily in front of witnesses. Unmaking decisions in front of witnesses required a kind of self-awareness that he had not demonstrated. He stepped forward and put his hand on Dorothy's shoulder and pushed. It was a dismissive push, the push of a man removing an inconvenience from his path, the push of someone who had never considered that the inconvenience might have consequences. Dorothy stumbled sideways into the snow. Her right knee went down. Her hand went out and found cold-packed snow, and she caught herself. She was on the ground for perhaps 3 seconds. The sound that followed was not loud. It was the sound of 9 men's boots in snow moving simultaneously, and it was the most purposeful sound Dorothy had heard in a long time, a sound with direction and intent and the particular quality of motion that has made a decision. Rance Bodine came around the motorcycles and through the space between Dorothy and Spivey and stopped with his face 8 inches from the deputy's face. He was 6 inches taller and significantly wider, and he had not slept and had not eaten and had spent the night in a concrete cellar after losing a house and watching a man nearly lose a leg. And he was, Dorothy could see from where she was getting back to her feet, entirely and completely prepared to be exactly as serious as the situation required. He did not touch Spivey. He did not need to. "You just put your hands on a 78-year-old woman," Rance said. His voice was very quiet. This was worse than if it had been loud. "In front of witnesses." Spivey's hand moved toward his service weapon. Not a draw, a touch, a reassurance, a man checking that his advantage was still present. "I wouldn't," Rance said, still quiet. From Spivey's left, slab had appeared. From his right, 3 others materialized from the ruined porch area. Behind the deputy, Dex was standing with his phone raised and had been standing that way since the SU-5 had come around the tree line. Dex, the youngest, the prospect who had understood before any of the older men, what the most effective weapon available to them actually was in this situation, and had been filming from the moment the vehicle stopped. Spivey looked at the phone. He looked at the men surrounding him on three sides. He looked at Rance Bodine's face 8 inches from his own, which contained no ambiguity whatsoever about what Rance Bodine would do if this continued in the direction it was heading. Dorothy got to her feet without help. Her knee ached. Her hand was wet with snow. She brushed off her coat with 2 deliberate strokes and walked to Wren and put her arm around the girl's shoulders. "Wren Calloway is not going anywhere with you today," Dorothy said. Her voice was level. "She is going to speak with a family court attorney and with the county social services office, and she is going to do those things before she has any further interaction with you. That is not a negotiation." "You have no legal standing," Spivey started. "I have a phone," Dorothy said. "I have a very clear memory of what you just did, and I have 40 years of working relationships in this county that you would find it instructive to consider." She looked at him steadily, the way she had looked at difficult situations for 40 years, directly without flinching, making sure she saw what was actually there. "I know every physician, judge, and social worker in Sheridan County by their first name. You might want to think carefully about how you would like this particular morning to be remembered." Spivey looked at her. He looked at Rance. He looked at Dex and the phone. The morning was very quiet around them. The storm-scoured sky was that impossible blue, and the snow was blinding in the early sun, and the ruins of the yellow house stood behind them, something that had burned down to its essential truth and had nothing left to conceal. Deputy Garrett Spivey walked back to his vehicle. He got in. He closed the door. He reversed down the driveway with considerably less dignity than he had arrived, with the SUV fishtailing twice before he reached the county road and turned south and disappeared. No one spoke for a moment. Then Wren made a sound that was not quite a sawma and not quite a laugh, and was authentically both of those things at the same time, and Dorothy tightened her arm around the girl's shoulders and held on. "He'll be back," Wren said. "Yes," Dorothy said. "And when he comes back, he will come back into a situation that is different from the one he left." She looked at Rance. "You mentioned lawyers." "I know the right people," Rance said. "Ones who do exactly this. We'll make calls this morning." He looked at Wren directly. "Nobody's going to make you go back, Wren. That part is done." Wren looked between them. She was 16 years old, and she had spent most of those years in temporary situations, moved from one to the next, and she had learned the way children in those situations learn out of necessity to read the difference between people who said things and people who did things. She had learned that the difference was not always visible on the surface, and you had to look at the pattern of what people had already done. She looked at Dorothy. She looked at Rance. "Okay," Wren said, quietly, the way a door opens rather than closes. Dorothy took a long breath of cold December air. "All right," she said. "Let's get gravel to a hospital." The goodbye that morning was brief and practical, which Dorothy respected. Rance shook her hand at Marion Fitch's driveway 5 miles down the county road, where Dorothy had brought her group after walking out to the road and flagging down the first vehicle that came through. Marion Fitch, 74 years old and unflappable, who had opened her door and taken them all in without requiring an explanation, and had simply started making coffee. Rance pressed a piece of paper into Dorothy's hand, a phone number written in blocky capital letters. "Anything," he said, "anytime, day or night." Dorothy looked at the paper. She folded it once and put it in her coat pocket. "Drive carefully," she said. The bikes went south on the county road and disappeared into the white horizon one by one, and Dorothy stood in Marion Fitch's driveway and watched them go until the last one was out of sight. Then she went inside to call the social services office. The months that followed were long in the particular way that months are long when the shape of a life is being rearranged. The insurance adjuster came in January, walked the ruins with a clipboard and a studied neutrality, and told Dorothy what she had expected to hear, that the payout would cover a portion of the rebuild and not the whole of it. The numbers were not enough to rebuild what had been there. She could build something smaller, something simpler, something that fit what the insurance company thought her life was worth. She put the for sale sign in the back of Marion's truck. It needed to live somewhere, and she did not want it in the house. She did not hammer it into the ground. She was not ready for that, and she knew she was not ready, and she was at 78 years old, entirely past the age of pretending to be ready for things she wasn't. Wren stayed. This was not a formal arrangement at first, and then it was incrementally the way things become formal when everyone involved simply continues acting as though they are already true. The attorney Rance had connected them with a woman in Casper named Bridget Armour, who specialized in exactly these cases and who had the manner of someone who had won difficult fights before and intended to keep winning them, moved quickly. The emancipation hearing was in February. In the week since the morning in the snow, Deputy Garrett Spivey had become the subject of an internal affairs review at the sheriff's department. The video Dex had taken was clear and unambiguous on the matter of the push, and clear enough on other things that the review expanded beyond its original scope. Spivey had been placed on administrative leave pending the outcome. He did not come back to Dorothy's land. Wren came to the emancipation hearing in a plain navy dress she had chosen herself at the department store in Sheridan, a dress that fit her properly, and that she wore with the straightforward dignity of someone who has decided to take themselves seriously. She answered the judge's questions directly and without embellishment, the way Dorothy had taught her in 3 weeks of kitchen table preparation. The judge was a man of 67 who had grown up in Sheridan County and known Harold Mercer by reputation. He granted the emancipation without extended deliberation. In the parking lot afterward, Wren stood beside Dorothy's borrowed car and looked at the February sky. "What do I do now?" she said. "Whatever you decide," Dorothy said. Wren thought about that for a moment. "Can I stay for a while?" "As long as you want," Dorothy said. Wren stayed. She was good with her hands. Dorothy had suspected this from how she had handled herself in the barn, the practical competence of someone who had learned to rely on themselves. She learned to drive the tractor before spring. By April, she could maintain it. She took an interest in the horses, particularly Clarence Jimmy's old quarter horse, 20 years old and arthritic and deeply indifferent to most people who, within 2 weeks of Wren's presence, had developed the habit of coming to the fence whenever he heard her voice. Dorothy watched this and thought about Jimmy, who had also been good with horses, who had also possessed whatever particular quality it is that old animals recognize in certain young people and decide to trust. She did not say anything about it. Some things did not need to be said to be understood. March arrived and the snow began to recede from the south-facing slopes, and the orchard fence line appeared from the snow in gradual increments, and Dorothy walked the fence line one afternoon and looked at the peach trees Harold had planted in 1979 and thought about the persistence of living things. She was in the rental trailer on a Tuesday in the second week of May, ironing a shirt because ironing was the kind of task her hands knew how to do without requiring her mind to participate when she heard it. The trailer was small and the walls were thin, and she heard the sound when it was still at the county road before it turned onto her driveway before it was anywhere close. She heard it the way she had heard it on the worst night of the winter, that low guttural vibration that begins below conscious perception and rises through the body from the feet upward. She set the iron down. She went to the trailer door and opened it and stood on the metal step. There were hundreds of them. She had no precise count, could not have counted them if she tried, because they stretched back down the driveway and around the curve of the tree line and presumably down the county road beyond, and she could not see where the column ended. She could only see the beginning of it, the leading edge of a river of chrome and leather and exhaust that moved through the greening Wyoming landscape like something geological, slow and permanent, and not to be argued with. They were not all the same. Different patches, different colors, different club names on different vests. She recognized the ironbound patch from December. Most of the others she did not recognize. Veterans MC in white letters on black. Iron Rangers MC. Other names she couldn't read at this distance. Colors and insignia from 3 or 4 states. And trucks. Pickup trucks and flatbeds interspersed among the motorcycles loaded with lumber. Bundled roofing shingles. Bags of concrete, mixed coils of electrical wire, stacks of drywall, a cement mixer on a flatbed trailer. Equipment that told its own story about intention. Leading the column on a Harley that was newer and cleaner than anything he'd been riding in December was Rance Bodine. He pulled up to the trailer and stopped and kicked down the stand and sat there for a moment in the May morning sun looking at her. He looked different than he had that night, rested present, the weight of 15 years visibly reduced in the set of his shoulders and the line of his jaw. He took off his sunglasses. "Morning," he said. Dorothy looked at the column still turning off the county road. She looked at the trucks. She looked at the lumber. "Rance Bodine," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "What is this?" "I told the Ironbound about Jimmy," Rance said. "Told them about the blizzard. Told them what you did for gravel." He looked at her steadily, the way he had looked at her across 2 feet of concrete cellar bottom at 3 in the morning. "Then I put the word out to every chapter in 3 states. Rangers who ride, veterans who ride, civilians who ride and carry a debt to a soldier they never got to pay in person." He paused. "Turns out there are considerably more of those than I expected." Wren had appeared beside Dorothy on the step, drawn by the sound, standing with her hand shading her eyes against the morning sun, staring at the column with her jaw slightly open. "I told them about Wren too," Rance said. He looked at the girl. "There are some carpenters in this group who specifically wanted to build a proper room for her." Wren said nothing. She was still looking at the column, still counting, still processing a number that was not resolving into anything manageable. A motorcycle pulled up beside Rance and stopped. The rider dismounted slowly with the careful management of a leg that was still relearning the full range of what it was supposed to do. He used a cane, a plain wooden cane, nothing elaborate, and he stood up from the bike and put his weight on it and looked at Dorothy. Gravel. He crossed the distance on the cane and stopped in front of her, and she could see the emotion working across his face, the deliberate effort of a man who was processing something he had not entirely worked out how to express. He was not built for easy expression. She could see that clearly, and she understood it clearly. He put his arms around her and hugged her. He was careful about it, careful of her age, careful of her size, but it was genuine, the full weight of what he meant to express, and she received it without pulling back. "You kept the leg," Dorothy said. "I kept the leg," he said. "Doctor says in another year, I'll barely have a limp." He pulled back and looked at her. "I can't repay what you did." "You can carry things," Dorothy said. "I've got a house to build." Gravel laughed, a surprise laugh, the kind that comes out before a person has decided whether they're going to laugh. "Yes, ma'am," he said. Dorothy looked at Rance. "What am I agreeing to exactly?" she said. 6 weeks, Rance said. "Maybe 8. We have the trades covered, licensed electricians, a plumber from the Billings chapter, who has been doing this for 25 years, a framing crew led by a man who built houses for 30 years before he started writing." Rance looked at the land around them, the orchard fence line, the open sky, the south-facing hills in the morning light. "We talked about the plans, bigger than what was there, wider doors and better insulation, and the south-facing porch." Dorothy looked at him. "Harold never built me the south porch," she said. "I know," Rance said. "You mentioned it. The second night in the cellar, while you were watching Gravel's color come back. You said Harold always meant to build it." Dorothy was quiet for a moment. "Jimmy described the view from the east side," Rance said. "Every man in that unit had heard about the view from the east side of the Mercer farm in Wyoming. But you mentioned the south porch specifically, and I wrote it down afterward." He met her eyes. "I wrote it down." Dorothy looked at the land to the south, the rolling hills and the far blue line of the mountains, and above it all the Wyoming sky, doing what the Wyoming sky did on a clear May morning, filling the entire upper world with something that made every human problem feel appropriately sized. "He wrote it down," Wren said quietly beside her. She said it with the tone of someone noting a thing that matters. Dorothy pressed her lips together briefly. Then she stepped off the metal step onto the ground. "All right," she said. "Let's get started." For 6 weeks, the farm was the loudest place in Sheridan County, Wyoming. Tents appeared in the fields the first morning in the small, organized city of them, because these were people who knew how to establish a camp and maintain it. Generators hummed. Radios played classic rock across the open ground. The smell of sawdust and coffee and barbecue smoke became the permanent atmosphere of the place, replacing the thin silence that had been there all winter. They worked with the focused efficiency of people who knew their trades and were doing them for a reason that mattered to them. The framing crew worked fast and well, the structure rising from the foundation in the first 2 weeks at a pace that seemed improbable until you watched the number of skilled hands involved. The electrician ran wire with the meticulous care of a man who understood that the people living in this house were depending on him to do it right. The plumber replaced the old galvanized pipe with copper and made Dorothy come inspect each joint before he covered it because he wanted her to be able to see with her own eyes. Wren worked every day. She was not assigned to anything specific. She simply found what needed doing and did it. She carried lumber. She held things while others fastened them. She learned to use a circular saw from a retired carpenter from the Bozeman chapter, who had the patience of a man who understood that teaching a skill properly took more time than doing the job yourself, but produced something that lasted. By the fourth week, she was cutting trim independently, and the retired carpenter told Rance she had better hands than most of the men he'd worked with in 30 years of framing. Dorothy watched and did not hover. She had always understood that the best thing you could do for a capable young person was stay close enough to catch them and far enough away to let them find out what they were made of. She made pie 3 times a week: peach pie from the orchard, apple pie from stores she'd canned and retrieved from Marion Fitch's basement, blueberry from frozen berries Marion had contributed without being asked. She made it in Marion's kitchen and brought it across in the truck and set it on the folding table by the generator and said nothing, and it was gone within minutes every time. She had one conversation with Rance about Jimmy that she had not had in the cellar or the days after. It happened in the fourth week, early morning, before the work started, sitting on the tailgate of one of the lumber trucks with coffee that was too hot and the mountain line sharp and clear to the south. "Were you happy?" Dorothy asked, "when you came back?" Rance thought about it honestly, which she appreciated, did not offer her the easy answer. "No," he said, "not for a long time. I knew why I was alive, and I knew what it had cost, and those two things were hard to hold at the same time without one of them breaking the other." Dorothy nodded. "Did you find a way through?" "Still finding it," Rance said. He looked at his coffee. "This helps." Dorothy looked at the rising frame of the new house against the morning sky. "He would have liked this," she said. "Jimmy, all of this." She gestured at the tents, the trucks, the early risers already moving towards the worksite with their tools and their coffee. He always believed people were fundamentally decent when you gave them a real reason to show it. He was stubborn about it. "He was right," Rance said. "He was usually right," Dorothy said. "He got that from his father." A pause. "And a little from me," she said. Rance looked at her and smiled. On the last Saturday of June, when the south-facing porch had been completed, and the paint was dry, and the orchard fence line had been restored, and the landscaping around the foundation was properly settled, Rance called everyone to the front of the house. They assembled in the yard, all of those who had stayed through to the end, and several who had left during the 6 weeks and come back specifically for this day. Dorothy stood at the front, Wren beside her. Sergeant sat between their feet in the manner of a dog who understood that staying close during important moments was part of his job. The house was yellow. Wren had chosen the color herself, driven to the hardware store in Sheridan with Gravel, who now drove with his right leg without thinking about it and stood in front of the paint display for 20 minutes before choosing. It was not precisely the same yellow as before. It was brighter, more deliberate. A yellow that had been actively chosen rather than simply continued. Dorothy had not been consulted. She had been glad not to be consulted. Rance led her inside. The living room was larger than the original, and the proportions felt right in the way that spaces feel right when the person who designed them was paying attention to how people actually live. The south windows were tall, and the light came in generously the way Dorothy had always wanted light to come in. The wood stove was new cast iron, set in the same corner as the old one. The floors were white oak, properly laid, the walls painted a warm cream that made the yellow from outside come through and become something slightly different and related. Above the fireplace on the new mantel was a painting, not a photograph, a proper painting oil on canvas framed in plain dark wood. And it was Jimmy. Jimmy at 23, crew-cut, jaw squared, but rendered in paint, and the effect of paint over photography was that the picture had depth and warmth and presence that photographs don't quite allow. He looked like he was looking back at her. He looked like himself. The painter was the wife of a brother from the Billings chapter who had done it from a digital copy of the original photograph and had not charged anything and had declined to hear about payment. Dorothy would find out the woman's name later and write her a letter because some things required a letter. Below the painting, mounted into the new brick of the new chimney on a horizontal bronze plate, were words. Dorothy read them. "In memory of James Jimmy Mercer, Ranger Soldier and brother, who ran toward the fire so others could walk away from it, to his mother, Dorothy Mercer, the Stormbreaker, who opened her door when she had every reason not to. Home is the people." Dorothy stood in front of the bronze and read it twice. She was aware of the room full of people behind her, the silence they were holding for her, the respectful space of people who understand that certain moments belong to someone else, and their job is to hold the frame while that person occupies the center. She put two fingers on the bronze lettering. The metal was cool. The letters were precise and deep cut, done by someone who understood that this was meant to outlast everything around it. She thought about Harold laying brick. She thought about Jimmy naming every stray dog sergeant, and about the Blake who had lived in her house for 11 years with that name, and about what it meant that she had given him that name without knowing why. She thought about 47 Christmases and a yellow that was a ridiculous color for a house in Wyoming. She thought about a storm. She thought about a door. She had opened a door in December with a gun in her hands and fear in her chest, and a decision to make, and she had made it the way she had made every significant decision in her life. Not because she was certain it was safe, but because she was certain it was right. Those were different things. They had always been different things, and the confusion between them was she believed responsible for most of the failures of courage she had witnessed in a long life. She had been certain it was right to open the door. She turned around. The room was full of people looking at her. Rough people, weathered people, people who carried their histories in their faces and their hands, and the particular way they held themselves in a room. Rance Bodine in front, arms at his sides, eyes doing what she had first seen them do on her old porch in the blizzard, asking. Gravel with his weight balanced carefully, and his cane and his living leg, the leg she had given back to him on the floor of a concrete cellar with a hunting knife and Harold's moonshine. Slab with his forearms crossed, and his expression trying to be neutral and failing at it entirely. Dex in the back, the youngest, who had carried her dog through the storm and filmed a corrupt deputy with steady hands, and who, was she, had decided some time ago, going to turn out to be someone remarkable. Wren beside her, the girl's shoulder touching hers, the girl who had spent her whole life in temporary places and was standing in a permanent one for the first time and knew it. Dorothy looked at all of them. "Who wants pie?" she said. The sound that came back at her was large enough to rattle the new windows in their new frames, and it was warm, and it filled the yellow house from the white oak floors to the freshly painted ceiling, and it went out through the tall south windows into the Wyoming afternoon, where it dispersed into the clean air above the mountains and was gone. But the house held. Every year after that, in the second week of December, the engines returned. The neighbors on the county road learned the sound of them over the first few years and stopped calling anyone about it. By the fourth year, they simply looked up from whatever they were doing when they heard the column coming and watched it pass from their driveways. The Henderson family, 3 miles down, made it a tradition to stand at the end of their driveway with thermoses of coffee to hand out as the riders went by. The riders always stopped. They always accepted the coffee. They always left. The sheriff's department had new personnel by then. Deputy Garrett Spivey had resigned during the internal affairs review process. His attorney had advised it as the strategically sound option before the review reached its conclusions. No one Dorothy knew expressed any particular regret about his departure from public service. Wren was enrolled at Sheridan College by the following fall, studying mechanical engineering. She drove back to the farm on weekends without being asked. She called Dorothy on Tuesdays, which was the day Dorothy had told her she was most likely to be available. This was not entirely true, but it gave Wren a reliable anchor point, and Dorothy had decided long ago that reliable anchor points were worth a small inexactness. Gravel stopped needing the cane 14 months after the surgery. He sent Dorothy a photograph of himself walking without it taken by someone else from a distance. So the photograph showed his whole figure in a parking lot somewhere, walking normally, the easy, ordinary motion of a leg that had been given back to itself. There was no note with the photograph. There did not need to be. Rance came twice a year, December for the anniversary, and once in the summer, usually July, when the orchard was high, and the porch that Harold had never gotten around to building was exactly what it was supposed to be, a place to sit in the long evenings with coffee and watch the light move across the mountains to the south in the last hour before dark. He and Dorothy sat on that porch one July evening in the second summer and didn't say much, and what they didn't say was not empty silence, but full silence, the kind that belongs to people who have said the important things and are now simply present in the same place at the same time. That kind of silence has its own language. Dorothy had learned it in 51 years of marriage, and she had not lost it. Sargent died the following October. He was 13 years old, which was a good age, and he died on the braided rug in front of the wood stove on a quiet morning in exactly the manner of Harold, quietly without drama, in the place he had always been. Dorothy sat with him for a while before she called anyone. She buried him under the orchard fence where the peach trees Harold had planted in 1979 still produced every August without fail, and she did not replace him immediately because she had never been the kind of person who replaced things before she had properly finished grieving the original. In the spring, Wren came home for a weekend. She arrived at the door carrying a small golden puppy she had found at the county shelter, held out in both hands with the expression of someone who has made a decision and is presenting its results rather than requesting permission. Dorothy looked at the puppy. The puppy looked at Dorothy with the dark, uncomplicated eyes of a creature that has not yet learned that the world contains anything other than warmth and interest in the immediate presence of whoever is in front of it. Dorothy looked at Wren. "Sergeant," Dorothy said. Wren smiled. "Obviously," she said. Dorothy took the puppy. She carried him inside to the living room, to the braided rug in front of the wood stove, and she set him down on it, and he turned 2 circles and sat and looked around the room with the proprietary satisfaction of someone who has found the place they were always supposed to be. Dorothy stood in the doorway and looked at the puppy on the rug and the painting on the mantel and the new bronze plate on the new chimney and the south windows full of spring light. She thought about doors, about the specific door she had opened in December in the worst storm in 30 years with a shotgun in her hands and fear in her chest and a decision to make. She had been afraid. She wanted to be clear about that, at least with herself. She had been genuinely afraid. Anyone who said they would not have been afraid was either lying or had not understood the situation. 9 motorcycles in a blizzard, 9 strangers who looked exactly like the kind of men you were afraid of in the dark. She had been afraid, and she had opened the door anyway. Not because she was brave in some uncomplicated way, because she was a nurse and a man was hurt, and she was the only person who could help him. And the choice between her fear and his need was in the end not a difficult choice for the kind of person she had spent 78 years becoming. That was all it had been at the start, a woman opening a door because a man was hurt and she was a nurse. Everything else had followed from that single act, the stories of Jimmy, the message she had waited 15 years to receive, the house she had thought she had lost, the girl who had needed a place to become herself, the army of strangers who had come to Wyoming in the spring with lumber and skill, and the particular loyalty of people who believe that debts of honor are real and must be honored. All of it. From one door opened in a blizzard by a 78-year-old woman who decided that her fear was less important than what was standing on the other side of it. Outside, the Wyoming morning was doing what Wyoming mornings do in the spring, spreading light across everything without preference, across the orchard and the open fields, and the south-facing mountains, and the yellow house that stood against the wide sky, with the particular quality of something that had been tested and had held, and had come out the other side knowing exactly what it was. Dorothy Mercer made coffee. She stood at the kitchen window where the photograph of Jimmy hung in its new frame, and she looked out at her land. The view was exactly what he had said it was, the best in the state.